777 City, A Tale of the Telephone by Julius Chambers. I went to my telephone exactly at 11 o'clock on the night of December 30th last winter to call up with my editor of the paper. My house was on the west side of Regent's Park, and the wire ran to the city telephone exchange. Apparently, my line was switched into connection with the Fleet Street exchange, but the delay followed. I was familiar with the peculiar hum caused by the induction of the wires, but that night the sounds were an unusual character. The operator at the city office had given me an unused wire. As I awaited the answering signal to indicate that the desired connection had been made, I heard two people talking in loud whispers to me unintelligible. Then I heard a door swinging on a squeaky hinge and hastily closed with a muffled sound. A cupboard door. Then silence. One of the people had entered the cupboard and closed the door. Then a knock unanswered. Immediately I followed a crash at the other end of the wire, and I heard the breaking in of a door. "John!" exclaimed a woman. "Ah, my lady, I have caught you at last," were the words of the intruder as he strode into the apartment, slamming the broken door against the wall behind. There was a metallic tone in the voice that made me chilly when he added, "Where is this scoundrel?" "I don't understand," were the frightened words of the woman. "Well, I do. He's in that cupboard." I heard the door squeak again, and the man in the cupboard step out. "At your service, sir," said a strange voice in a low with a shiver in it. "I knew it, woman!" fairly screamed the head of the family. "Don't be a brute," said this calm, low voice. "I'm here. Settle with me." "You dog!" hissed the first speaker as he sprang for the offender, overturning a table covered with bric-a-brac, and a mortal combat began. In a momentary lull, I could distinguish the breathing of two infuriated combatants, and I heard the rustle of a woman's dress as she swept across the floor, an opening and closing of a door. The unfaithful creature had abandoned her lover, not a sob nor an entreaty of mercy. I was sure of the facts and understood the situation as if I'd been in that apartment. The contest was resumed, and crash after crash of broken furniture attested to its savage character. Who were these men, and where? Unquestionably in a house where the telephone had been left open or an interruption had occurred during its use. Had the receiver been hung up, the communication with the room of the mystery would have been severed. The wire leading thereto was crossed with the one given to me to use. The struggle was to the death. I could hear the breathing of the contestants as they lay on the floor, but neither man asked quarter. The door reopened, and to a woman's sobs were added the appeals of forgiveness. One of the two men had overpowered the other, which was the victor. A pistol shot, sharp and crisp. Then the stillness of death. It was death. The hush could be felt over the unknown length of wire connecting me to the murder chamber as I ear witness to the crime. Whispers broke the silence. A window was raised. Now shall I hear the cry of murder? No. Somebody looked into the street, presumably to ascertain if the pistol shot had been heard by passing pedestrians. That indicated the home to be a populous neighborhood, although the open window did not emit sounds of passing vehicles. Then the window was slowly closed. Next, I heard the strike of a match. Merciful heavens, this deadly conflict had taken place in the dark? The lover had been killed, but would the lighted match reveal to the husband the face of a stranger or of a well-known friend? What would be done with the body? "Are you through?" asked the telephone clerk at the city exchange. "No. Mark that wire with which I have connected. It doesn't go to Fleet Street, but I must know where it runs. Mark it as you value a £5 note. I'll be at your office as soon as I can get there." "All right," was the prompt reply. The clerk at the City Exchange tied a ribbon around the plug that carried the end of the wire leading me to the unknown house. I related the entire incident and appealed to his curiosity and avarice. As I was destined, he inadvertently had switched me open to an abandoned line. It had been put up for a special occasion and cut out thereafter. It was a lost wire and did not lead to the Fleet Street Exchange, or anywhere else. After making tests, the clerk reported that the communication with the house of the crime no longer existed, but as an explanation he pointed to a thermometer outside the window. "Make a memorandum of that temperature," he said. "What's the use?" "You understand how you got into that house on the lost wire?" "No." "At a certain degree of cold, that house line contracted sufficiently to cut in on a dead wire and thus connect us, for a brief space, with the chamber of the murder, wherever that may be." "We must be careful to have this correct," I said. "Now, comprehending the operator's meaning, what does the temperature register?" "Exactly 0. The body of a young physician of social prominence, Henry Clay Stanage, brother of Dr. Oscar Stanage, so prominently identified with the Jasper case, was found on the side of the path at Hyde Park the next morning. He had died from a pistol shot in the right temple, and near the corpse was a weapon with one chamber discharged. Evidence in support of the theory of suicide was so strong that a verdict of effect by the coroner's jury disposed the case in the public mind. I saw the body and found finger marks on the throat, and a rent in the back of the dress coat. The young gallant had died at the hand of my murderer. Stanage bore the reputation of a gay boy. All attempts to establish the whereabouts of the physician on the previous night came to naught. Part 2. The only clue I possessed was an abandoned wire. I engaged a telephone man to find the house of the crime, hoping thereby to bring the murderer to justice and, incidentally, to secure a piece of sensational and exclusive news for my journal. The lineman was zealous and overconfident, but at the end of 2 weeks he had lost the wire near Elephant and Castle. He believed the house we sought to be in Brixton. He sneered at all suggestions from the telephone operator. "An ear trumpet chap can't tell me how to work," said he contemptuously. "I didn't learn my trade that way." Another wire expert was hired, and I told him the story. Perhaps I had not been sufficiently frank with the first man. The new telegraphist adopted the suggestion of the exchange operator and said, "An accidental crossing of wires caused by contraction admitted you to that room and enabled you to hear the murder done. We only have to wait, Mr. North, until the thermometer registers 0, then ring up the dead wire from the City Exchange and ask, 'What number is that?' You will have landed your game." That seemed to be simple, but the winter was unusually mild. Although I retained the man in my pay for a month, there wasn't a moment in which the thermometer touched 0. We kept ceaseless vigil, one relieving the other at the city telephone office during enforced absence of sleep and meals. I took a room in a boarding house near the exchange, that I might be easily within call. Nothing must thwart this case. One night the weather moderated, and I deemed it safe to go to Kensington to pay a call I had owed for a long time. While I was away, the temperature fell so rapidly that it was within 1 degree of the desired point. The clerk at the exchange hurried a messenger to the address I had left with him. In the warm house of my friend, the condition of the weather had been forgotten, but on the street that night was bitterly cold. Possibly the hour had come. At the first chemist's, I saw a thermometer outside the door. Jupiter! The mercury was exactly at 0. A cab carried me to the city telephone exchange in half an hour. I stepped inside and connected. The dead wire rang. No answer. Glancing through the window glass at the thermometer outside, I saw that the weather had slightly moderated. The reading thereon was 2 degrees above zero. There it hovered for an hour. Then the mercury slowly descended into the bulb. Now it stood at 1.5 degrees. 10 minutes later, the record was less than a degree above. I rang vigorously but did not hear any sound at the other end. In my anxiety, I forgot the thermometer. When I looked again, the mercury had moved up 0.5 degree. Another wait succeeded, and I had almost decided to give up the vigil for the night when the bell connected with the dead wire rang. Snatching up the receiver, I asked, my voice almost tremulous, "Well, what number do you want?" "Who are you?" was the rejoinder. "This is the exchange. What number do you want?" Kensington," was the curious query after a moment's hesitation. "Yes, what is your number?" I asked, in hopes of obtaining from the unguarded answer the information I had been so anxiously seeking. "Ah, you want to know what number this is?" I recognized the voice. I was talking to the murderer. My murderer, as I had often mentally designated him, to distinguish him from everybody else's murderer, of course. And wasn't he mine? Only one other living person knew him beside me, the woman who had witnessed the killing and had remained silent as a prize of forgiveness. "What is your number?" I asked again. "Find out," was the reply. Then I heard the phone hang up. It seemed to me that I had not learned anything new. I was deeply chagrined for a moment, but taking stock of my knowledge, I had acquired much valuable information. First, I confirmed the theory that the house I sought had to be reached by a wire that hung in close proximity to the abandoned line. Second, the short house wiring hung over, not under, the long copper wire, because the contraction of the copper wires of which the house connections were made was slight. Third, the man and the house I sought were in Kensington, not Brixton, as the first expert had concluded. And fourth, my murderer was usually home at night. Fifth, his telephonic connection was made through the Kensington exchange. Sixth, the man I believed guilty was on his guard and was very suspicious of my inquiries. He would probably be wary of my telephone in the future. On the other hand, he would not dare to have it removed at this time. The dead wire was my only clue. My next step was to go to the office of the telephone company and secure an appointment as a receiver in the Kensington exchange. I was inconspicuous, and I donned the remarkable headgear and receiver's wear. The wear and worry of the work nearly crazed me for the first day. The steel band that encircled my temples completely disorganized my brain. A month passed, and I was no nearer the solution. Despair was overcoming me, when a new suggestion of the greatest importance was made to me. "Has Moxley tested the wires as usual?" asked one of the operators during the day. "Not this week," replied the exchange superintendent. All customers were frequently called up by an expert to ascertain that the wires are in good order. If I could become Moxley's assistant, I reflected, I might be able to hear my murderer's voice again. I secured the place and made my appearance at the Kensington Telephone Exchange as Moxley's helper, not a position calculated to turn the head of any man. I was delighted and believed success assured. My duties were to carry a galvanometer and rheostat, but I divided the supposed wages with Moxley. He consented that I should test the wires. I was a bachelor, he assumed, and I could live on little money. Besides, he liked to encourage enthusiasm in young men. Moxley guaranteed to make me an expert in 3 years. "Judge Riley's the best lineman in England," said he, "and Riley began with me as a helper." Only one operator was in the office when we arrived, because the telephone is not in much demand before 10 o'clock. I tested the private lines, of which there were several hundred, and sought in vain for the voice. 63 customers failed to answer when I called, and I marked these torpid wires, hoping that one I wanted was among them. Having completed the test of the private wires, I began making connections with the pay stations throughout the district. A curious thing occurred. I rang up a station in Camden Hill. I heard the receiver taken off the hook, but no reply came in answer to my summons. I called again and yet again. No reply. Warm as was the day, I felt no chill in my spinal marrow. I heard the door unlocked, and an instant later the squeaking of a hinge. The wire led into a cupboard. Again, I asked for a response. Finally, the phone at the other end, wherever it might be, was replaced on the hook. And silence. Part 3. I left the building, called a cab, and drove to the address of the number I had rung up. It proved to be a chemist's shop near Holland Park. Showing my credentials, I demanded to know why the inspection call had not been answered. The chemist was civil and explained that he had observed the previous summer that on hot days the communication with the exchange was interrupted at times. He stoutly maintained that the bell had not sounded. I tried it and called up the Kensington Exchange without difficulty. The druggist was in no wise nonplussed. He merely pointed towards the street and said, as he waited to turn on a customer, "You forget that it is raining. The weather is colder." True, there had been a heavy shower while I was in the cab, but so intent was I in pursuit of my only object in my life that I hardly observed it. I understood the chemist's meaning. The case of the first wire had attempted to be run down. The bit of metal I saw doubtless passed over the abandoned line. By the same reasoning, the wire that had been again led me to this modern Francesca's chamber by another route was strung under the one that entered the chemist's shop. Zero weather contracts the metal in one case. Summer heat lengthens the line on another. Contact was made at two different places. The coefficient to this last problem was unknown to me. The druggist had not noticed the thermometer just prior to the shower because he took the temperature only at 9, 12, and 3 o'clock. I remember the telephone standard at the top of the London Life Assurance Building Company, where Sergeant Dunn had machinery that automatically recorded every change in the weather and an impeccable tally. I asked the exact thermometrical reading just before the heavy rainfall. Consulting the cleverly devised instruments, he replied, "Exactly at 90 degrees Fahrenheit." The degree of summer contract with the lost wire had been established, but that was all. I must go on. Had I located the section of the city where the criminal lived? I feared not. This wasn't a crime of the slums, but the use of a telephone did not necessarily indicate respectability. Why not start as a chemist and run down the wire from that point? The end of the rainbow never seems very far away. I sent for Moxley and told him that I wanted to ascertain. He looked knowing, said the task would be easy, and he'd take a day off to do it. Although he gave a month to do the task, he did not find the house and the woman or the man. But he was full of explanations and showed how, wholly by accident and not by design, the people on the other end of the wire were absolutely safe if they did not make a break themselves. The days drifted along into September. The warm weather was gone, and I could hope not that the 90-degree weather would recur. It was equally impossible to restrain my curiosity until midwinter. I engaged a room in a boarding house adjoining the Kensington telephone station. The cables came along thereto underground and were carried up the side of the house in a covered box to the roof, where the strands were separated and hung upon a rack, from which they were conducted to the operating room below. The discovery that the wires were brought into the station by underground complicated matters seriously. What was strung aloft at some point of length, but where did it leave the subway, and how could I... I did what I now did what I ought to have done long before, and secured the services of George Riley, the most expert trouble man in the country. When the whole subject was laid before him, he pronounced unequivocally in favor of starting at the city office and run down the wire. A long chase was more likely of success than a short one. Riley went to work with zest. With his experienced eye, he had no difficulty in following the abandoned wire along Holborn, thence down to New Oxford Street, where, without apparent reason, it switched off to the roofs, which it followed to Victoria, when it returned to the Underground. By the end of the third day, Riley was in full cry through Lambeth and into Kensington, down as far as Pearl Street. At Brixton Station, it made a long jump over the top of a tall building, over the railway bridge to another building. Riley believed that he was close upon a solution to the mystery. Out on Brixton Road, atop a telephone pole, emerged a bright copper wire. It crossed closely above the line it was following. This practiced eye told Riley that the two wires were liable to have a contact by the contraction of the long wire. The stretch previously mentioned was more than 1,000 feet in length, and at zero temperature the contraction would be fully 2/3 of an inch. Nothing could have been easier than to tie the two wires together and to bring up the house of the crime. But Riley thought that course was unwise. My murderer, as I still called him, was on his guard. Having kept the secret for 8 months, he knew exactly what he was about. I was waiting at the City Exchange for a following day when Riley called me over the public line and asked me to ring up the dead wire. I did so, and someone exclaimed, "Is that you, John? When will you return? Better come at once." It was a woman's voice, that of the woman who had begged for mercy. Standing back from the transmitter, I asked, "Where?" "To the... bzz, bzz." The connect was broken. I called up Riley and told him to tie the two wires together, and he did so, but I could not get my lady's ear again. I asked Riley what he thought. In his opinion, the woman lived in Brixton, and the wire ran in that direction. Riley accounted later in the day in a change of mind. The copper wire was a private one, running from a city office to a private house in Brixton. He had traced it to an office building in Cheapside. The wire did not go to Brixton, as he had supposed, although it ran in that direction a good way. Telephone wires are often pieced together, he explained, and the lineman will sometimes make appropriate an old wire to make it through a long detour. The members of the firm in whose office the line ended were easily discovered. Riley slung a coil of wire over his shoulder the next day and entered the office. He asked for the telephone and was shown into a private room of the firm, Gasper, Todd, and Markham. At his desk sat John Perry Gasper, solicitor, aged 57. Riley was not a student of men. He could not read character as he could a Morse instrument, but the wire was what he wanted, and now that he had found one end of it, nothing appeared easier than to secure the other. After having made 2 or 3 pretend tests on the machine, he went away. The instant he reached the landing outside his office, his manner changed. He sprang down the stairs into the bank in the ground, where he asked the city directory. There was the residence of John Perry Gasper was given, Cheapside and Kensington. Madly triumphant, Riley hurried to my address and rushed breathlessly into my room. In a few words, he revealed his success. I was as jubilant as he. We hurried to Kensington to look at the house. We almost ran. No difficulty was experienced in finding the building. It was a corner house of splendid proportions, and the name Gasper shone audaciously upon the doorplate. While my thoughts were busy as to my next action, Riley's were occupied with a different text. He had surveyed the building from all possible points, and in a thoroughly appreciative way, but when he came back from a hasty walk down the side street, he was pale and trembling. "What's the matter?" I asked. "Matter? Well, knocked out. I don't understand, was my reply. Can't you see that there isn't a telephone wire entering that house? What wire is that? He asked, in dismay, pointing upwards. Oh, that's the district messenger call. Notice it runs from pole opposite the stable and is the cheapest iron. There isn't any telephone at the house. See, a reference to the telephone catalog, which we ought to have. The more he was mystified, the clearer became the solution to me. It was a case of another woman, another family. Nevertheless, the other end of the wire at the house of the murder was either very far away as ever. One thing I could establish at once, and I would make the rest. Strange that I had allowed the moment to elapse when I had learned Gasper's connection with the case. I went to the nearest call office and called up Gasper Todd Markham, Cheapside, and asked to speak to Mr. Gasper. I hadn't thought what I should say when a voice answered, "I'm Mr. Gasper. What do you want?" I only had sense enough to reply, "When did you take the telephone out of your house?" "Never had any in it," was the curate's retort. After waiting a moment, he added savagely, "And I don't want any." This was the voice. Gasper's name was John. Riley went back to Gasper's office to see the telephone. Gasper was not there, and the expert examined it more carefully. He discovered that the wires that led through the back of the little box, in which the phone thence into a large wardrobe. This was locked, but a moment's exclamation showed that the two wires left that concealed clothes press. They went out of different windows, but they came from the same switch, a switch inside the wardrobe, by which a private wire could be cut in or cut out. The line over which I had called the office obviously had been a different one from that leading to the mysterious room where the shooting occurred. This was really a discovery. I speak of it as a discovery, although it was, as yet, merely an assumption. But Riley was sure that the switch existed in that cupboard as if he had seen it. As he told me his story, I remembered that the office had not responded when the wires were tied together. The bell hadn't rung because the private wire had been switched out. One bold stroke, I thought, and we shall have the story. My next step was startling. I had been admitted to the bar years before. I called upon a prominent KC friend of mine and secured letters of introduction to John Perry Gasper, and finally wrote asking if I might call with the certainty of a private interview. He named the following afternoon. I presented my letters. One of them was from the chief of police. I watched the lawyer's face and a big tremor across as he broke the seal of the big blue envelope bearing the arms of the department. I waited for an inquiry from him as to my business, but he was stolid, immobile as marble. His dull gray eyes appeared slowly in drawing themselves inside his skull. The eyelids gradually closed in a particular squint. Riley was waiting in the hall, and I knew the moment had come. Now for audacity. "Will you let me have an expert examine the cupboard immediately behind your telephone?" "There's no cupboard behind it," was the quick retort. "Yes, there is, right behind the door against which the phone box sits." My voice trembled, and I was very pale, but my nerves did not fail me. Gasper took up the letters one by one and read through them more carefully than before, and then muttered, "Go to the deuce." "Not until I find the other end of the private wire leaving from the next room," I retorted. "If you refuse, I shall return with a search warrant and thoroughly turn over the entire place. The warrant will be based on the charge that you are defrauding the telephone company, but that will not be the real accusation. Your arrest, which will follow, will mean what? That you are charged with the murder of Harry Stanage, who was found dead in Hyde Park last winter with a bullet in his head, and your pistol by his side." I was sure of a sensation, but it came in an unexpected way. "That's your game, is it?" the voice ringing with exultation. "If ever a man deserved to die, that scoundrel did." It was my turn to be surprised into speechlessness. "Look here!" exclaimed Gasper, rising to his full height behind the desk. You're after blood, but man to man, I stake my life I convince any judge or jury that the rascal died at the right time. Denounce his murderer, arrest him, and indict him, hang him. If you can, I shall defend him with my last extremity, and every technicality known to the law. But you know the murderer. As to who killed Standage, Gasper fairly screamed, that is for you to find out. My KC friend assures me that the case is not complete because evidence heard over telephone is not admissible by a court of law. Gasper knows that as well as the public prosecutor. Therefore, I alone, of all living men, know how Henry Standage died.